Welcome to the Arts and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall, starring A.M. Hall. Now, here is A.M. Hall.
Welcome to Art and Oddities with A.M. Hall, where I talk about anything that strikes my fancy, to include all kinds of creative works, from children's cartoons to underground zines, to identity politics and everything in between. My guests and I will discuss how art impacts and reflects culture and counterculture, enables individualism and conformity, and have loads of fun along the way. I am your host, A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. This episode, I talk about the artful oddities that I found at my local flea market, and how too many treasures can actually be a bad thing. Then I sit down with artist and show producer, Panik Bedlam, to talk about her Blood Trillium Tarot deck, and the general difficulties of discovering your own magical path. Stay tuned. A few weeks ago, I went to a local flea market, which is not something I do very often because the nearest one is unfortunately over an hour away from where I live. This particular trip took even longer because of some traffic issues, but at the end of the day, it was worth it. Man, I just love flea markets, you know? I found a old style metronome with the wavy thing that goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, tick, 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 tick. Oh, I love those things. It's clearly a reproduction of an older model. It's not an antique. There's like particle board on the underside, and it's not an antique. But the fact that I got this thing it's really super cool. And, you know, we might use it as like a prop for a movie or something, or a meditation device. I'm really looking forward to using it as a meditation device. And I like the fact that as a metronome, it has a visual component to it. Most modern metronomes are just tick 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 without any kind of like visual aid that you can see from the corner of your eye. And I really like that. So I might actually use it as a metronome at some point, but I don't know. I probably won't, but I might. One of the things that I saw there that I ended up passing up on was a gigantic antique sewing machine. And we're talking an industrial machine here. It had a table the size of this desk that I'm sitting at, which of course you cannot see because you're a podcaster, but but it was enormous. And the sewing machine itself was like that old black style cast iron with the beautiful Victorian lines to it. But it was an industrial model, so it wasn't that gorgeous. It had an industrial feel to it. And the motor was on the underside of the table. Gigantic motor. I'd say it was, oh gosh, I'm looking around to see how big this thing was. I don't know. It was on the larger side. Not like the pot motors that come with sewing machines today. Now, I already have an antique sewing machine, actually. I have a Victorian style cast iron sewing machine that was, it's from the 1940s, and it has beautiful gold decals with the Victorian lines, but it is from the 40s. It is made right on the cusp, like right on the transition point between the old style and the new style sewing machines. There's this very harsh transition between sewing machines that have that Victorian style to them and the ones from the 50s where they have that futuristic clean lines. Sewing machines had a very harsh transition at that point. There was a very brief period where they were still made of cast iron but had the new style, like the new lines, and then all of a sudden they just became made from steel. So the one that I have, which is from the 40s, has an external motor. So the way an old treadle sewing machine works was you don't just hit the treadle and the machine goes. There is a belt that connects from the treadle at your feet all the way up to the flywheel on the right side of the sewing machine. And the way that an external motor sewing machine works is it actually has a belt that goes from the motor, which is right there, to the flywheel. So it's literally the same mechanism that's turning. This is a machine that is easily converted from a treadle machine to a motor machine. It could be converted back and forth easily. I have replaced the motor on it at least once since I originally acquired it, but I'm pretty sure that the cabinet it came in is original to the machine because it has the 1940s styling to it. Unfortunately, I don't really like the cabinet very much. The 1940s styles don't it doesn't really appeal to me very much. It is very sturdy, but the main reason I don't really use the sewing machine very often is because of the way the cabinet is built and the way the machine is set into the cabinet. In order to sit at the machine properly, I have to straddle the left leg of the cabinet, which is unfortunate. So I tend to shy away from using this machine just for that very reason. And it's a very sturdy desk. It would make a very good writing desk for someone, but it's just not the desk for me. I found a few other things at the flea market too that I passed up on. Unfortunately, I found a sleeve board that that I could have gotten, but I ended up passing up on it because it would have required some work. It would have required some additional padding to it in order to use it as a real sewing tool. And so at the end of the day, I decided to pass up on the sleeve board because even though I could have padded it up and used it, I knew I wasn't going to. So it's important to keep the things around that are going to inspire you to actually work on your projects and are not just going to take up space in your craft room or your, whatever. And sometimes you need to know to get rid of stuff too. It's important to keep, supplies in stock, and it's important to have the proper tools. But space for new stuff is important too. I'm probably going to get rid of this sewing machine cabinet just because it does not serve my purposes. So, make sure you have the supplies you need and make sure that you pass up on the ones that you really don't. Go forth and use your supplies to make some good art. Oh, that's hokey even for me. Oh, what are you going to do? I will wrap up here, and don't forget to check out the flea markets in your town. Here's the rest of the show. Stay tuned. I am here today with returning guest to the show, Panik EVlynn Bedlam. That's Panic with a K. And today we are going to be talking about magic with a K.
Yes, we are.
All right, so Evie, can you tell me a little bit about your magical beginnings and how you I understand you had a little bit of trouble with self-initiation versus formal teaching.
Well, when I was a kid, like I explain in my art and occult nonsense books, I was very interested in magical subjects from an early age. A story I like to tell is apparently I was specifically at the age of 8 trying to create a homunculus in my playhouse out of moss and several other things, specifically using the word homunculus. But from there, I'd kind of been trying to figure out some way to get into that. Like, I went through the same process that every weird little kid who wants to be into magic goes through, where they go asking and irritating the local librarian about where they keep the real books, you know.
Huh.
So I kind of looked around, and there were other people as I got older who were into this, especially as I got into my teens, but unfortunately, not a lot of them wanted to take on apprentices or students or really share their beliefs. I could find books and stuff around, but most of the stuff either really didn't vibe with me. Like Wiccan stuff, like I couldn't really find a. This is personally, I couldn't find anything about it to grip onto. And a lot of the stuff that I ended up reading was more mythological in nature, more poetic in nature. When I got into my early 20s, this kind of changed. I did go through some kind of group initiations and stuff like that, most of them like secret society like in nature. And that has its benefits and help. It shocks your system somewhat. But I kind of, after having seen what the big fuss was about, what I realized all the introspection that I had done in high school and my early 20s was actually more important to how I related the inside of my head to the outside world, which to me is what a lot of magic has to do with.
Okay. Now, I understand you had some trouble with the magical symbolism that was available. You had some
Yeah.
trouble specifically with the tarot decks.
Well, when I grew up, there was a magic store nearby. It was like a gift shop that just had a bunch of weird books, but it also had like crystals and a shelf full of occult books and such. And I had several tarot decks, some of them modern, some of them more traditional. I
a copy of the Rider-Waite, and I had a copy of the Thoth deck and stuff like that. I also had one with dragons on it and all that sort of stuff. The problem wasn't necessarily that I didn't understand the symbols or that I was unable to like read a bunch of books and learn what they were supposed to mean and just repeat what was in the book. That was problematic to me because even though I understood these archetypes that you were trying to deal with, I didn't quite resonate with them. They always sort of missed the mark. It's like watching a show that you know is good, but you don't relate to any of the characters, or
Mm-hmm.
all the costumes are really terrible. There's something about it you can't connect to, and that was a lot of the problem. There was something about it that I liked. That, I always point to one of the early. I always liked monster movies, especially the old ones as a kid. And the Wolfman had a wonderful tarot reader character at all the best lines,
Huh.
and that's what I wanted. That person who was genuinely insightful, who was giving real kind of mystical advice, not just repeating what the card means to anybody who sits down across. And I kind of thought that tarot cards was a good place to start. If you look into any magical system, especially Western ones, we love like divination cards. Most systems of magic usually have some form of divination where you can get information about what's going on either inside you or outside of you. To me, the more important thing when it comes to magic is the inside journey, and the tarot cards give you a sort of mirror to look at that. But if you kind of learn a process of storytelling and advising another person, you can look at that cards, look at that person across from you, and tell them a story that they'll find useful. In my opinion, it's much more psychological than psychic, but there are people who certainly approach it from those talents. That's just not the talent that I have.
I see. But I understand you had a problem with the symbolism of traditional decks, and so that led you to creating your own deck, the Blood Trillium.
Yes, the first version of this deck that I made, which I believe it was almost 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even 8. It was a black and white deck, which, even though I do a lot of color artwork nowadays, black and white always appeals to me. There's stuff you can do with optical effects if you have very solid line work like I do. Like I do a lot of pen and ink, black and white. And you
Mm-hmm.
can get some very interesting optical effects. You can also emulate features of kind of a block printing or an etching, and I really like playing with that, and it makes it look a little bit old despite the kind of comic book nature of my style as well. It kind of makes it weirdly timeless while at the same time modern. I also thought gave it sort of a darker quality as well. A lot of my cards have a little bit more of a darker feel going on, and this is mostly because I have kind of a lot of inside journey stuff that I brought up for this. I'm not afraid of facing my own nightmares and my own darkness, and once you get past that, in most people, there's a lot that's actually very wise and very thoughtful and intuitive if you can get past all the noise in your head and all the scary stuff that you've dealt with. And I tried to bring a lot of that up and present it on the cards. It's all the same archetypes. Some of them I present inverted, or every card actually has a reverse meaning labeled on it. So, because I'm the one who created these cards and their symbols, and I know where they came from, I immediately know what the card means looking at them. Like, I could learn what the other cards meant, but I don't have that visceral reaction to the them in the same way that I react to my own art. I also wrote poems on the sides and such for sort of the same purpose.
You mean on the sides of the cards there?
Yeah, illuminated along the edge. On the major arcana, I put haikus, and I did so on the minor arcana as well. The face cards I sort of left unadorned. I just simply put god images on them that were personal to me, thinking that, oh, well, I'll know these stories, and I'll just refer to them, because that's why I put god archetypes that were appropriate to the card, because it would spawn me into talking about the stories and use those stories to advise somebody I was fortune telling for, or for me, it was an important recognition. As I found other people wanted to use them and I released the new ones, I wrote something similar to sonnets that, in a very abstract way, try to sum up what these entities meant to me. But, so, probably over answered your question there.
Well, yeah, but let's go back to some of what you said there. How does the symbolism of your deck, the Blood Trillium deck, differ from some of the symbolism in more traditional decks?
Well, what I try to do is I try to, if possible, not necessarily approach the symbols and the archetypes from the traditional angle. One that you kind of recognized early on when I was showing it to you was the difference between the Hanged Man in my deck and others, where in a traditional sense it's normally a man suspended upside down from a tree by his leg, showing a different perspective. My version of the Hanged Man is a woman in a padded cell wearing a straitjacket with a bonsai tree next to her and a spilled bottle of pills. And instead of it being labeled the Hangman, it's labeled the Hangman, but it's also labeled the Traitor for its inversion.
That's the inverted form.
And my take on the card doesn't have to do with an altered perception as the typical Hangman does, even though it's the same archetype I'm approaching. Mine has more to do with the person who is punished for being themselves versus the person who punishes themselves in order to fit in. The person who doesn't have the truth of their conviction that they're not living to how they perceive the world, or they are living to how they perceive the world and it's making their life not a fun time. So your perspective has a lot to do with it, and a lot of the cards have those sorts of dualities about them. The card means something, but how it's read one way versus the other way, or in neutral readings, drastically changes the inflection of what the card will mean. Every card can say anything. That's one of the tricks about reading tarot is any card can mean anything within a certain subset. You know, the Lovers, as I present it, is the Lovers, which represents choice, to doubt. Are you passionately enthralled with the decisions you're making, or are you constantly questioning them? That's a theme that almost anybody can relate to, and if you draw it at random from a deck and mention that that's what's going on, you'll see a look across most people's faces as they recognize, oh, this is a problem that I have. Well, it's a problem everybody has about something.
Yeah. Tell me about your minor arcana and why they look the way they do.
In the original version of the deck in black and white, which people can see, I already provide the PDF in several places where you can download it and print it out and cut it out on cardstock yourself. But one of the things about it is the cards look like relatively traditional Western playing cards. I do mix the suits. There are the hearts, the spades, the diamonds, the clubs that we're used to here in America.
They're also, they also have, each suit has two names, doesn't it?
Yes, and they also have their more classical equivalent, or at least a stand-in for their classical equivalent. Swords, wands. I just picked coins instead of pentacles, which is, a choice up in the air depending on what tarot tradition or playing card tradition you come by. And then, what would typically be cups I replace with bottles.
Okay.
But each card has that, so even the minor arcana have an inversion. And then I format them on the page to kind of convey... Well, let me go back a little bit. When I first was trying to learn how to read for other people, I found that it was much easier for me to read using playing cards than tarot cards, because I felt like I had to say something specific to tarot cards. Whereas I could look at the playing card suits, and any symbol simple enough can become anything. There's a story I like to tell that Joseph Campbell also tells about a child who turns clothespins into a boy, a girl, and a witch just by telling themselves stories. Any symbol simple enough you can turn into more than it is and draw people in closer because they can't see it without your words. That sort of thing appealed to me, but unfortunately what ended up happening is a lot of people looked at these black and white cards and said, oh, that's a little too simple, it looks a little lazy, it looks boring, even though it's not just, them laid out there in the number. They're set up to have a very physical story that relates to what the card feels like. In the updated version of the deck that I released about a year ago, that's
this one being in color.
This one's in color with more poems on the sides, like I had said. I tried to add as much color to those cards to convey the movements, the feeling, the ideas of this. And even though they're still very abstract in comparison, people now look at them and they can see this story a little bit better. I still like to read with my black and white cards. I find it easier, but people like color. That's what I've learned over time.
Yeah, people certainly do. Can you tell me, do you have any future plans for this deck?
Well, as I said, I've I have the color version now available. It's been available for the last year, and that I do print on demand on thegamecrafter.com. Just search Panik Bedlam, Panic with a K, and you'll find that and another deck that I do with you called the Magician Daughter one, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
I'm sure we will.
Unfortunately, the Game Crafter, though the cards are of outstanding quality, given the size, format, difficulties I have with it, they cannot produce a box for it. So what I'm hoping to produce, once I can source them, is custom bags, and I'm also working on instruction manuals for this deck and the Oracle deck that I mentioned earlier as well. If I can get enough investment in it, I was hoping to put kits together for both of them. I'm also hoping, I had done some videos on Facebook some time ago that were trying to give specific tarot instruction on how to just read for people. And I wasn't too happy with the way they turned out, but I've have some friends around who are doing a lot of videos lately, Mr. Tej66 and Nix Eradicatus, to name a few, our friend EW Motomac
Yes.
also. They're all doing videos, and I'm feeling left out, so I think I might get back into that. So.
Okay. I think we're just about out of time for the day. Thank you.
Oh, it looks like it, yeah.
So thank you so much for agreeing to be on my show once again, Evie.
Anytime. I'm always here, all the week.
All right. Please stay tuned for the credits as we wrap up the show. Thanks for listening to the Art and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall. That's our show for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go through the grueling task of leaving us a review on whatever platform you're using to listen. I have a new and improved URL for the iTunes page. It's tiny.cc/amhall, or just Google Art and Oddities podcast for the player of your choice. The production of this podcast has been provided by today's guest, Reverend Panik EVlynn Bedlam, and without her it would not exist. If you'd like to support this podcast, why not put a virtual tip in our jar at patreon.com/panikbedlam. That's PANIKBEDLAM. As we produce more shows, we will be putting more content on Patreon exclusively for patrons. A PDF of the black and white version of the Blood Trillium Tarot is available to download for free in the show notes at panikbedlam.com/podcast. The color version is available for sale at thegamecrafter.com. Panik has another deck, the Magician Daughter Oracle deck, for sale at the same site, and has several books for sale at lulu.com. Links are available in the show notes. Our theme music, Doxal Dance in Space-Time, or Belial and His Seven Wives, was composed and performed by Kion Huru Orion, or as I know him, Michael. Thanks, Michael. If you would like to contact the show with comments or suggestions, you can email us at artodditiespodcast@gmail.com. Next week, I speak on the phone with punk rock musician Tim Batty, lead singer of Dandelion Pipe Bomb. Gosh, I just love a name like Batty, don't you? Don't miss it. That about wraps it up. Remember, the highest form of magic is doing, and expressing yourself is art. This is A.M. Hall, signing off.